Let me tell you something. When you wake up on a Tuesday morning in the middle of January, shuffle to your front door in your slippers, and find a bright orange violation notice rubber banded to your mailbox post in 6 inches of fresh snow, your first instinct is to laugh. Your second instinct is to assume it's a mistake. And your third instinct, once you actually read the thing, is to stand there in 12-degree weather with your mouth hanging open while your coffee goes cold in your hand, and a very specific name forms in your brain like a thundercloud. Terri Abernathy. That was the name. That was always the name. I'm Wayne Sanders, and I've lived in the Pinecrest Meadows subdivision for going on 7 years now. 7 years of minding my own business, keeping my lawn trimmed in summer, shoveling my driveway in winter, waving at my neighbors, and generally doing everything a reasonable person does when they live in a neighborhood with an HOA. I knew when I bought the house that Pinecrest Meadows had a homeowners association. The realtor made sure to mention it in that careful, diplomatic tone real estate agents use when they're trying to tell you something uncomfortable without actually saying it. She said, and I quote, "The community is very well maintained. There's an active HOA." What she did not say was, there is a woman on that HOA board named Terri Abernathy who will become the primary source of aggravation in your adult life. That would have been useful information. I first crossed paths with Terri during my second summer in the neighborhood. I'd planted a small vegetable garden along the side of my house. Nothing crazy, just some tomatoes and peppers in raised beds. Terri showed up at my door with a printed copy of the CC and RS. That's the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the HOA Bible, and pointed at a clause that said front-facing landscaping had to be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. My vegetable beds were on the side of the house, technically not front-facing by any reasonable definition, but Terri had a very creative interpretation of front-facing. We argued about it for 20 minutes on my porch while a bumblebee investigated her hair. I eventually moved 2 of the beds 6 inches further back, which satisfied absolutely nothing in the actual rule book but seemed to satisfy Terri, which I came to understand was the real goal. Not compliance, Terri's satisfaction. Over the years, I developed a clear picture of who Terri Abernathy was. She was maybe 55, always impeccably dressed even for informal neighborhood business, with that particular style of highlighted brown hair that reads as aggressively put together. She drove a white Lexus SUV that she parked at precise angles. She carried a clipboard everywhere she went in this neighborhood, an actual physical clipboard with actual paper on it. She had been on the HOA board for the better part of a decade, serving as compliance officer, which was a role she had essentially invented for herself, and which no one had ever successfully argued her out of. She'd had spats with at least half the neighborhood over the years, the Delacroix family over their basketball hoop, old Mr. Perkins over his wind chimes, the Nuyens over the color they painted their shutters, a color called coastal mist, which Terri felt was insufficiently beige. Every conflict followed the same pattern. Terri identified something she didn't like, found the most tortured reading of the CC and RS that could be argued to prohibit it, issued a fine or a notice, and then waited for the homeowner to either fold or fight. Most people folded. It was just easier. I had folded more than once myself, and I'm not proud of that, but 7 years of low-grade HOA harassment has a way of wearing you down. This winter, though, this winter was different. It started in late November when the forecast came in looking like something out of a disaster movie. The meteorologists were not kidding around. Western Ohio, where Pinecrest Meadows sits, was in line for a brutal stretch starting just before Christmas and running well into January. Arctic air mass, lake effect amplification from Erie, the whole package. They were talking sustained temperatures in the single digits, wind chills below zero, and back-to-back snowstorms that could easily drop 2 feet of accumulation over the course of a few weeks. I took that forecast seriously, because I had lived through one of those winters before and I knew what it meant. You prep. You stock up on food. You make sure your furnace filters are clean. You test your generator if you have one. And if you heat with wood at all, you make sure you have a serious supply of firewood. Now, my house has a wood-burning fireplace in the living room that I use as a supplemental heat source. It's not the primary heat. I have gas forced air for that, but during a really brutal cold snap, having a fire going keeps the living space warm and comfortable and takes some of the load off the furnace. I genuinely enjoy it. There's something deeply satisfying about a wood fire when it's howling outside, and over the years I'd gotten into the habit of stacking a good cord of firewood against the backyard fence every November. My backyard fence is a 6-foot cedar privacy fence that runs along 3 sides of my backyard. It's a solid, good-looking fence that I installed myself about 4 years ago after getting the appropriate HOA approval. Yes, I went through that whole process, submitted the application, waited 6 weeks for the committee to discuss it, got my approval letter, hired a contractor, had it inspected. I did everything right. The fence is exactly 6 feet tall, which is the maximum allowed height in Pinecrest Meadows. Not 6 feet 1 inch, 6 feet. I measured it during installation because I knew that if Terri Abernathy ever had cause to look at my fence, she would have a tape measure. So every fall I stack my firewood against the inside of that back fence, up against the panels, nice and neat. I use a stacking method where I split the logs consistently and build a stable, tight stack that sheds water and seasons well. I cover the top with a tarp. It's a good setup. I've been doing it for 5 years without a single issue. This particular November, with the brutal forecast looming, I ordered a cord and a half instead of my usual cord. A cord and a half of firewood is a lot of wood. It's a substantial pile, and when I stacked it against that back fence, split and tight, it went up and up. And because I had 50% more wood than usual, the stack topped out somewhere around 7 feet. Maybe 7 feet 2 or 3 inches at the highest point. It was a tall stack of firewood against a 6-foot fence, and the tops of those logs absolutely did poke up above the fence line. I did not think about this. Not for 1 second. I covered the top with my big blue tarp, tied it down, felt good about my winter prep, and went inside to make a pot of chili. That was the beginning of November. I had no idea what was coming. December hit like a wall. The first storm rolled in the second week of December and dropped 14 inches in about 36 hours. I was out there with my snowblower at 6 in the morning clearing my driveway and the sidewalk in front of my house because that's what you do. The roads were a mess. The subdivision's private road crew was falling behind, and half the neighborhood was struggling. Pipes were threatening to freeze all over Pinecrest Meadows. Mr. Perkins, next door to me, had his furnace go out on December 13th, which in retrospect I should have paid more attention to because of what happened later. The cold was vicious, genuine wind chills of -15 on some nights, and I was burning through my firewood at a solid clip. A fire in the evenings, sometimes keeping it going through the night on the worst nights. I was glad I had ordered extra. Then Christmas came and went. New Year's came and went. We got another storm on January 4th, a brutal one, another foot of heavy wet snow on top of ice. The roads in the neighborhood were treacherous. There was a period of about 4 days where I didn't drive anywhere because the roads were simply not worth the risk. I ran out of rock salt on January 7th and had to borrow some from my neighbor Dave Marchetti, who always has a 50-pound bag in his garage because Dave is the kind of guy who is prepared for everything. It was during this stretch, right around January 8th or 9th, that Terri Abernathy apparently looked over her back fence, or maybe drove slowly past the alley, or maybe deployed some combination of her binoculars and her clipboard, and noticed that the top of my firewood stack was visible above my fence line. The notice arrived on my mailbox on the morning of January 10th. I've already told you about finding it. Standing there in the snow in my slippers, steam coming off my coffee, mouth open, slowly reading what this woman had actually written. The notice was typed on official Pinecrest Meadows HOA letterhead. It was formal, officious, loaded with citations to specific CC and R sections, and it informed me, Wayne Sanders of property at 2214 Pinecrest Drive, that I was in violation of Section 7, subsection 4, paragraph B of the community's governing documents, which stated that no structure, permanent or temporary, could exceed the maximum approved fence height of 6 feet. My firewood stack, the notice claimed, exceeded this height and constituted a violation of community standards. I had 14 days to bring the property into compliance, or I would be assessed a fine of $150 per day until the violation was corrected. $150 per day for firewood. In January, in the middle of the worst winter in a decade, I went inside. I sat down. I put my coffee on the table. I read the notice 3 more times, and then I picked up my phone and called my neighbor Dave Marchetti because Dave is a retired attorney and I knew this was going to require both his expertise and his company. And frankly, I needed someone to be outraged with me before I did anything rash. Dave answered on the second ring. I could hear him scraping ice off something in the background. I read him the notice over the phone. There was a silence when I finished, and then Dave said, "Wayne, is that your phone making that noise, or did you actually start a fire in the background?" I said no, I just turned the fireplace on because I was cold and angry. He said, "Good. Don't let it go out. I'll be over in 20 minutes. Dave Marchetti is 63, stocky, with a gray beard he's had since approximately the 1980s and a habit of wearing flannel shirts year-round. He spent 30 years as a litigation attorney before he retired, which means he has the particular combination of analytical sharpness and casual demeanor that makes good lawyers dangerous. He doesn't get excited or theatrical, he just gets precise. He showed up at my door with a thermos of coffee and his reading glasses hanging around his neck, and he took the notice from my hand at the door and read it walking down my hallway into the living room. He sat down in the armchair closest to the fireplace. I sat across from him. He read the notice twice more. He set it on the coffee table. He looked up at me. "Okay," he said. "First thing, is your firewood stack actually over 6 feet?" I told him yes, at its highest point, probably 7 feet or a little more. "Is it a structure?" he said. I said it was a pile of wood covered with a tarp. "Right," he said. "That's point 1. Section 7, subsection 4, paragraph B says no structure, permanent or temporary, can exceed the fence height. The word structure has a specific meaning. It typically means something built or assembled with the intention of being permanent or semi-permanent. A tarp-covered pile of firewood is neither a structure nor permanent. It is consumable material stored temporarily. That is a meaningful distinction. I was already feeling better. Point 2, Dave continued. She has cited your firewood as a visual violation that impacts community standards. But what standard? The section she's citing is an architectural restriction. It applies to sheds, gazebos, pergolas, built structures. Has she ever enforced this against anyone else with anything similar? Garden furniture, stored equipment, kids' play sets. I thought about that. The Hoffmans down the block had a playset in their backyard that was definitely taller than 6 feet. I'd never heard anything about that. I mentioned it to Dave. He nodded slowly. Selective enforcement, he said. That's your second angle. If she's enforcing this provision against your firewood but not against the Hoffman playset or anyone else with a similar situation, that is selective enforcement, and it exposes the HOA to a fair amount of liability. HOAs have lost lawsuits over selective enforcement. Third point, he said, leaning forward. Look at this fine structure. $150 per day. Let me ask you something. Does your CC and R actually authorize per-day fines at that rate for a first-time violation of this nature, or does it require a notice and cure period? Most HOA governing documents require a formal written warning, a reasonable opportunity to cure the violation, and then a hearing before the board before any fine can actually be imposed. She skipped straight to daily fines. That may not be legal. Dave took the CC&R document off my shelf. I always keep a copy handy, another thing Terri had trained me to do over the years, and started reading. I made us both more coffee. Outside the living room window I could see the street covered in packed snow. My neighbor Mr. Perkins' house with a big space heater visible through his window, smoke from my own chimney visible if I looked out the front. It felt very much like the world had been distilled down to a small, cold radius, and the center of my problems was a piece of orange paper on my coffee table. Dave read for about 15 minutes. He flagged 3 sections with sticky notes he produced from his shirt pocket like a magician. Then he looked up and said, "Wayne, she absolutely did not follow the prescribed process. Section 12 of this document requires written notice, 30 days to cure, and a formal hearing before the board before any per-day fine can be levied. She issued this notice with a 14-day cure window and no hearing provision. This fine, as currently written, is unenforceable." I asked him if he thought I should just move the wood anyway to avoid the hassle. He looked at me over his reading glasses. "Wayne," he said, "it is January 10th. The forecast shows another storm next week and temperatures dropping to -5. You have a cord and a half of firewood stacked in your backyard for a legitimate, necessary purpose. You have not violated any clear rule because a pile of firewood is not a structure. You are being harassed by a woman with a clipboard and a grudge. Do you want to move 2,000 pounds of frozen firewood in sub-zero temperatures because Terri Abernathy looked over a fence?" I said I did not. "Good," said Dave. "Then let's document everything and fight this properly. I want to pause here and tell you about the security camera situation, because it becomes important later. About 2 years ago, after someone, I have my suspicions about who left a fake pet waste violation notice on my door that turned out not to be an official HOA document at all, but was rather a personally typed note with the HOA letterhead color matched on a home printer. I had installed a security camera system. 4 cameras: front porch, backyard, side yard, and one covering the driveway and the alley behind my property. They recorded continuously to a hard drive and kept 30 days of footage at any time. I had those cameras, and I had not told Terri Abernathy about them. This matters because over the next few days, I noticed some activity that I would not have caught otherwise. The first evening after I received the violation notice, my backyard camera picked up something at around 9:15 at night. The alley behind my property is not well lit, but the camera has night vision, and what I saw was the distinctive white Lexus SUV belonging to Terri Abernathy parked at the end of the alley with its lights off. She sat there for about 12 minutes. Then the SUV drove slowly down the alley behind my property, stopped, and someone got out briefly. Then the SUV left. I pulled up the footage and watched it twice. I couldn't tell what she was doing exactly, but she was in the alley at 9:15 at night with her lights off, stopped behind my property. That was interesting. 2 days later, on January 12th, I got a second notice. This one was even more aggressive. It informed me that my firewood stack was now also in violation of what Terri's notice described as a visual obstruction provision related to alley access. The language was convoluted, and the CC&R citation was to a section that, when I looked it up, was actually about street-facing visibility for vehicles exiting driveways. My firewood was not near any driveway. My firewood was in the back corner of my yard. The citation made no sense. I called Dave again. He came back over. He read the second notice and he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Wayne, this woman is making things up. She is citing code sections that don't apply to your situation and hoping you don't read closely enough to notice. That is not an honest mistake. That is deliberate misrepresentation." I showed him the camera footage of the Lexus in the alley. He watched it twice. He stroked his beard. He said, "Save every frame of that. Do not mention it to anyone yet." Over the next week, I started doing something I should have done years ago. I started talking to my neighbors. Not casually, but systematically. I walked through the neighborhood in my heavy coat and boots, knocking on doors, asking people if they'd had issues with the HOA recently. And what I found was like pulling a cork out of a bottle that had been under pressure for a very long time. The Delacroix family, who I mentioned had had the basketball hoop issue, had also received a fine that winter for their portable propane heater on their back patio, which Terri had deemed a prohibited outdoor appliance. Their furnace had been struggling in the cold, and they'd set up the patio heater in their enclosed back porch to keep the pipes from freezing. $100. They'd already paid it. My neighbor on the east side, a woman named Patricia Chu who was quiet and kept to herself, told me she had received a fine in December for having salt bags visible in her open garage. Not in the driveway, in her garage. Terri had apparently photographed Patricia's open garage from the street as she drove by and determined that the visible salt bags violated the provision about keeping garages free of unsightly stored materials visible from the street. $75. Patricia had paid it because she didn't know she could fight it. Mr. Perkins next door, the one whose furnace had gone out, told me something that stopped me in my tracks. He said that in early December, just before his furnace failed, he'd had a propane delivery scheduled. A large delivery, because he has a propane furnace and a propane fireplace, and was also stocking up for the winter. He said that on the morning of the delivery, he'd gotten a call from the propane company saying his delivery had been put on hold because someone had contacted them claiming there was an ongoing dispute about access to the property. Mr. Perkins had scrambled to sort it out. It had taken 3 days to reschedule, and in the meantime his furnace had struggled on the reserve in his tank. When the temperatures crashed, the furnace couldn't keep up and ultimately gave out a component that the technician said had been stressed by running too lean on fuel pressure. The furnace repair had cost Mr. Perkins over $800. He didn't know who had contacted the propane company. He'd assumed it was a mix-up. But now, listening to everything else I was collecting, I looked at him and I said, "Did you recently have a disagreement with Terri Abernathy?" He blinked. "About 2 weeks before my furnace went out," he said. "She sent me a notice about my wind chimes again. I called her and told her in no uncertain terms what I thought about that. She didn't take it well. I went home and sat with that for a very long time. If Terri Abernathy had called Mr. Perkins' propane company and caused his delivery to be delayed, that was not an HOA matter. That was not a petty neighborhood dispute. That was interference with a utility delivery, in the middle of a winter storm, to an elderly man with a propane furnace. That was potentially criminal. I called Dave. He didn't say anything for a moment when I laid it all out for him. Then he said very carefully, 'Wayne, if that's true, we are not talking about HOA nonsense anymore. We are talking about reckless endangerment. We need to find out whether it's true.' Here is where the story gets very methodical, and I want you to understand that what happened next took time and careful work and the support of more people than I ever expected. But it was worth every minute. First, Dave helped me draft a formal response to both violation notices. It was a 5-page letter citing the specific procedural failures in Terri's process, the inapplicability of the code section she had cited, the legal definition of structure, and why Firewood did not meet it, and a demand that all fines be immediately rescinded. We also included a formal request for a board hearing per Section 12 of the CC and RS, because we knew they would either deny it, which would be another procedural violation, or grant it, which would give us a platform. We sent the letter certified mail to each board member individually, not just to Terri, because we wanted every single person on that board to have it in their hands and to know they were personally aware of the procedural issues. Then I started working the propane company angle. Mr. Perkins, who was fully on board at this point and was in fact absolutely furious, called the propane company himself and asked to speak to a manager. He explained that he had experienced a significant mechanical issue that he believed was connected to the delivery delay, and asked if they could review the record of who had contacted them and why his delivery had been flagged. The manager was sympathetic. It took a few days, but she called Mr. Perkins back and told him that a call had come in from someone claiming to be from the Pinecrest Meadows HOA, stating that there was an ongoing access dispute at his address and that deliveries should be paused until the issue was resolved. The caller had identified herself by name. She had given her real name. Terri Abernathy had called Mr. Perkins' propane company and given her real name. I cannot tell you the expression on Mr. Perkins' face when he told me this over my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of him. It was the expression of a man who has been the victim of something and finally has the evidence to prove it. He was 71 years old, and he'd paid $800 for a furnace repair he shouldn't have needed, and he'd been cold and stressed and scared about his heating during the worst stretch of winter in years. And someone had done that to him deliberately, out of spite. Dave, when I told him, got very quiet in that way he has when things get serious. Then he said, "Wayne, I need you to understand something." Calling a utility company and falsely representing that there is a property access dispute in order to cause them to delay a delivery to a private residence in winter conditions is not a civil matter. That is potentially criminal interference. It could be prosecuted under utility service interference statutes, and given the consequences: furnace failure, property damage, an elderly man exposed to dangerous temperatures, a prosecutor could certainly argue this was reckless. "We need to go to the police." We went to the police on a Wednesday afternoon, me and Dave and Mr. Perkins. The roads were still icy from the latest storm, and we drove carefully to the township police station. We sat down with a detective named Holloway who was thorough, skeptical in the way good investigators are, asked a lot of good questions, took Mr. Perkins' account and the information from the propane company, and asked for the documentation of the call. He also asked about Terri's role as HOA compliance officer and whether she had any official authority to contact utilities on behalf of residents. She absolutely did not. The HOA's authority extended to enforcing community standards within the property. It did not extend to contacting private utility providers on behalf of or against individual homeowners. Detective Holloway said he would look into it. He was not making promises, but he was not dismissing it either. He took copies of everything. Now, while all this was developing, I had a board hearing to prepare for. The HOA board had responded to our certified letter not by immediately rescinding the fines, but by scheduling a hearing, which was technically the correct procedural response and meant they'd read Dave's letter carefully enough to know they were on thin ice. The hearing was set for January 23rd. I had 12 days to prepare. I want to tell you about those 12 days because they were some of the most unexpectedly community-building days I had experienced in Pinecrest Meadows. Word had gotten around. I hadn't been loud about it, but I hadn't been secretive either. And when your neighbors know that you're fighting the HOA about a firewood stack, and they also know that the same woman may have been responsible for Mr. Perkins' heating crisis, the neighborhood's appetite for her authority dries up pretty fast. People started coming to me. The Nuyens brought me a printed copy of every fine they'd received over the past 3 years, carefully filed in a folder. 7 fines. 3 of them for the same recurring paint color issue that the HOA had never officially classified as a violation requiring action, just as something they preferred be changed. The Nuyens had paid all 7 fines because they didn't want trouble. Over $1,000 across 3 years. A couple named the Harrises, who I barely knew because they lived on the far end of the subdivision, had a similar story about a driveway extension they'd gotten fully approved in writing only to be fined twice for the same structure after the approval had been issued, with Terri claiming the approval had conditions that she had verbally communicated and which were not in writing anywhere. Dave started keeping a master list. He called it the pattern because that's what it was. A pattern of fines issued improperly, fines for violations that didn't clearly exist in the CC and RS, fines for conditions that had already been approved, and fines that seemed to correlate with personal conflicts between homeowners and Terri Abernathy. We counted 11 neighbors with documented complaints. 11. In a subdivision of maybe 60 houses. The night before the board hearing, I went over everything with Dave one more time. He'd organized it into a presentation I could give in 15 minutes. We weren't going in angry. We weren't going in theatrical. We were going in with documentation, with legal citations, with a pattern of conduct, and with enough quiet, solid evidence to make the other board members very uncomfortable. The board hearing was on January 23rd at 7 in the evening in the subdivision's community room, a medium-sized space attached to the pool building that sat unused in winter. It was 12 degrees outside. Inside the community room, when I arrived, there were a lot more people than I expected. I'd mentioned the hearing to my neighbors, but I hadn't specifically asked anyone to come. They came anyway. I counted at least 30 people sitting in folding chairs when I walked in, with their coats still on because the space heater in the community room was losing the battle against the cold. Dave was there. Mr. Perkins was there. The Delacroix family, Patricia Chu, the Nuyens, the Harrises, people I'd never spoken to but who knew what was happening and had showed up anyway. The HOA board sat at a folding table at the front of the room. There were 5 board members. Terri Abernathy sat at the far right, dressed impeccably as always, with her clipboard and a face that conveyed the controlled irritation of someone who had expected a much smaller audience. The board president was a man named Gerald Hutchins, who I had always found to be a reasonable, somewhat passive person who tended to go along with Terri because she was the loudest voice in the room. The other 3 board members were people I recognized, but had never had significant interactions with. Gerald opened the meeting and went through the procedural items. Then he introduced my case. He summarized the violation notices and my written response. Then he invited me to speak. I stood up and I kept it calm and clear. I explained why a pile of firewood is not a structure under any reasonable legal definition, and I cited 3 separate legal sources. I explained that the fine schedule Terri had applied required a procedural process that had not been followed. I explained the selective enforcement issue and pointed out that the Hoffman playset, among other examples, had never been cited for the same provision despite being taller than the fence line. I kept my voice level, and I watched the faces of the board members who were not Terri Abernathy. They were getting uncomfortable. Then Dave stood up and spoke as a neighbor, not as my attorney, though his attorney background was not a secret to anyone in the room. He spoke for about 10 minutes about the documented pattern of improper fines and procedural failures across the subdivision, and he laid out the legal liability the HOA was potentially accumulating for itself. He cited selective enforcement case law. He was calm and methodical, and the room was very quiet while he spoke. Then Mr. Perkins stood up. He is not a dramatic man, not a loud man. He said simply and clearly that someone identifying herself as Terri Abernathy had called his propane provider in December and caused his delivery to be delayed, and that the resulting furnace failure had cost him $812 in repairs, and that he had spent several days in dangerous cold in his own home at the age of 71. He said this in a steady voice, and then he sat down. The community room was so quiet I could hear the space heater struggling. Gerald Hutchins was staring at the table in front of him. 2 of the other board members were staring at Terri. Terri's expression had gone through several distinct phases in the past 30 seconds, the flash of something that might have been fear, then the reassembled composure, then what I can only describe as the specific look of a person calculating how much of this they can deny. She started talking. She said Mr. Perkins' claim was baseless and defamatory, and she had never called any propane company. She said the firewood fine was a clear and reasonable application of the rules. She said the documentation Dave had presented was misleading and taken out of context. She was smooth and confident, and if I hadn't had what I had in my coat pocket, I might have watched the board start to slowly back her up just to avoid the conflict. I reached into my coat pocket and I took out a thumb drive. I asked Gerald if I could use the community room's laptop to show one more piece of evidence. Gerald, looking faintly desperate for any way forward, nodded and said yes. I plugged in the drive. I pulled up the backyard and alley camera footage from the night of January 10th. I walked the room through what we were looking at. The white Lexus SUV. The alley behind my property. 9:15 p.m. Lights off. I let it play. I watched Terri's face while the room watched the screen. She saw that it was her car, and she knew it was her car, and the audience around her was watching her face as they watched the footage. And there was a specific moment where she understood exactly how this looked and exactly what it meant. I then pulled up a second clip, timestamped from December 8th, which I had spent a fair amount of time cataloging through the alley footage, which showed the same white Lexus SUV parked in the alley behind Mr. Perkins' house for about 8 minutes. This was 4 days before his propane delivery was flagged. I pointed out the date and the address. I said I wasn't claiming this proved anything conclusively, that the police were already looking into the propane company incident, and that I would be providing them with this footage as additional context. I said that calmly and clearly, and I watched the blood leave Gerald Hutchins' face. The room started talking. Not chaos, but the kind of sustained, forceful, many-voiced conversation that happens when a community that has been sitting on frustrations finally has permission to let them out. Gerald tried to maintain order. I sat down and let it happen. Dave sat next to me and was quiet. Terri tried to speak, but nobody was interested in what she was saying anymore. Gerald called a 5-minute recess and the board huddled. When they came back, Gerald looked older than he had when the evening started. He said that given the information presented, the board was immediately suspending both violation notices against my property pending a full review. He said the board would be commissioning an internal audit of all fines issued in the past 3 years. He said that any fines found to have been improperly issued would be refunded. He said the board was also suspending Terri Abernathy from her compliance officer role, pending the outcome of the police investigation into the propane company matter. Terri said loudly that this was unacceptable and she would be consulting her own attorney. Dave, from beside me, without even raising his voice, said, "That's probably a good idea, Terri." Several people in the room laughed. It was the release of something that had been building for a very long time. Terri stood up, gathered her clipboard, and walked out of the community room with all the dignity she could manage, which I will admit was a fair amount even then. The door closed behind her, and the room stayed noisy for another 20 minutes while Gerald tried to figure out how to run an HOA meeting without its most dominant presence for the first time in a decade. Now I want to tell you what happened over the following weeks, because the story doesn't end in that community room. Real things happened after that night, and they're worth telling. The police investigation moved faster than I expected, probably because the evidence was so concrete. Terri had given her real name. There was a recording of the call at the propane company's end, because they record customer service interactions, and the call was definitively matched to a phone number registered to Terri Abernathy. Detective Holloway called me in mid-February to let me know that Terri had been formally charged with interference with public utility service, and given the circumstances, winter temperatures, elderly victim, documented property damage, the prosecutor had added a reckless endangerment charge. Those are real charges, not traffic violations, not civil matters, criminal charges that required her to appear in court. I won't pretend I didn't feel a complicated mix of emotions about that. Even with everything she had done, the fact that it went criminal was sobering. But then I thought about Mr. Perkins sitting in his cold house for 3 days, spending $800 he shouldn't have had to spend, worried about his pipes and his health, because someone was angry that he'd spoken sharply to her about wind chimes, and the complicated feeling simplified considerably. Terri entered a plea of not guilty and her attorney went to work, which meant the legal process would take months. What happened more immediately was the HOA audit. The board hired an outside HOA management firm to review 3 years of compliance activity. It took about 6 weeks. The results were, in the words of the management firm's report, indicative of a systemic pattern of non-compliant enforcement activity. They found 34 fines that had been improperly issued. Some were procedural failures, required notice periods not followed, hearing rights not offered. Some were substantive failures, fines for things that either were not violations under the actual CC and RS or had been previously approved. A few were what the report carefully called inconsistently applied, which in plain language meant selective enforcement. The total amount of improperly issued fines was just under $9,000 across 34 homeowners. $9,000. In a 60-home subdivision, quietly extracted from people who assumed the fines were legitimate because the notices came on official letterhead and were written in confident legal-sounding language. The board voted unanimously to issue full refunds, every dollar, with an additional letter of apology to each affected homeowner. I watched Gerald Hutchins, who I had always considered a sort of well-meaning bystander in all of this, sign those letters with the expression of a man who was genuinely ashamed that things had gotten this far on his watch. I think it was deserved, honestly. He had known something was off for years and he'd never pushed back. But I also think watching the results of that inaction laid out in a report in front of him changed something in how he was going to run things going forward. Patricia Chu, who had paid $75 for having salt bags visible in her open garage, got her money back. The Delacroix family got their money back. Mr. Perkins received his refund, and also, after a negotiation I was not directly involved in but heard about, received a separate settlement from the HOA's liability insurance for the cost of his furnace repair, because the board's own attorney advised them that the HOA had potential liability for the actions of its compliance officer. $812 every cent. The HOA restructured its compliance process entirely. No more one-person compliance officer role. Violations now required 2 board members to sign off on any notice before it went out. The fine schedule was rewritten to clearly mandate the prescribed notice and cure and hearing process before any dollar amount could be assessed. The new rules were posted on the subdivision website and mailed to every homeowner. They also, at my suggestion, delivered at a subsequent board meeting where I was more welcome than I'd ever been, adopted a firewood storage provision that explicitly categorized firewood as consumable stored material and not a structure, clarified that the fence height provision did not apply to it, and set a practical guideline for firewood storage based on fire safety and access, not aesthetics. That provision passed unanimously. I feel good about that one. My firewood stack, which by February I had burned down to about half its original height, sat behind my fence all winter without another word from anyone official. I finished it off in late February during one final cold snap, the last gasp of that brutal winter. I sat in front of the fireplace on the last night I burned those logs and thought about how a stack of firewood had somehow become the thing that broke open 7 years of quiet, accepted nonsense. I thought about Terri Abernathy, who would be dealing with her criminal case through the spring, who had lost her position on the board and whatever identity she'd built around that clipboard and those violation notices. I thought about Mr. Perkins next door and whether he was warm enough. I got up, went to the kitchen, put together a pot of soup, and knocked on Mr. Perkins' door. He answered in a thick sweater with the television going in the background and the house a good warm temperature, his furnace humming along perfectly. He looked at the soup and then at me and he said, "Come in, Wayne. The news is on and they're saying it might warm up next week." I went in. I sat down. We watched the weather forecast together, and sure enough, a warm front was coming. The kind of mid-February thaw that makes you believe winter might actually end this year, that the cold doesn't go on forever, that things do eventually loosen up and let the light back in. Terri's court date eventually came in late spring. I wasn't there, but Dave was, out of professional interest. He told me afterward that she'd reached a plea agreement. The reckless endangerment charge was dropped in exchange for a guilty plea on the utility interference charge. She received a fine, community service, and a supervised probation period. No jail time, but a criminal record. Dave said she showed up to court dressed impeccably, as always, and sat very straight and did not make eye contact with anyone in the public seating. Gerald Hutchins called me the evening after the court date. He said he wanted to apologize personally for not having done more over the years to check the way compliance was being handled. He said he'd gotten comfortable deferring to whoever was loudest and most prepared, and that comfort had cost people real money and real hardship. I appreciated that he called. I told him so. I also told him that the new structure the board had put in place was solid, and that if he ran it the way it was written, Pinecrest Meadows would be fine. He said he planned to. That summer, the Nuyens repainted their shutters. The new color was called seafoam, and it was absolutely nothing close to beige, and it looked great, and nobody said a word about it. Mr. Perkins reinstalled his wind chimes on his back porch. They made a very pleasant sound on windy days, and I could hear them faintly when I sat on my own porch, which I did more often that summer than any previous summer, because I found I liked this neighborhood more now than I had in a long time. There's something that happens when people go through a shared difficulty and come out the other side knowing each other better. The neighborhood felt lighter. People waved from driveways differently, with more eye contact, more time taken. Dave Marchetti came over for a cookout in July. He brought his wife, who I'd only met twice before, and she was wonderful company. We sat on my back patio with burgers and cold drinks, and at one point Dave raised his glass and nodded toward the back fence, where the firewood rack now sat empty and clean, waiting for October when I'd load it again. "You know," he said, "most people would have just moved the wood." I shrugged. "It was January," I said. 2,000 pounds of frozen firewood in negative temperatures." "No," he laughed. "That's the whole story right there." It kind of is, actually. It's easy to go along with things because going along feels easier in the moment. Move the wood, pay the fine, avoid the conflict. Every single time someone in my neighborhood had paid one of those improperly issued fines, they'd made the rational short-term decision. It cost less, in immediate terms, than fighting. What they'd paid for was the continuation of the thing that was costing them. I don't blame them. I had done the same thing for years. But sometimes the moment arrives when the ask is just absurd enough, and the weather is cold enough, and you're angry enough, that you decide the 2,000 pounds of frozen wood stays exactly where it is. Come October, I ordered my usual cord and a half again, stacked it against the fence, nice and tight, covered it with the tarp. It went up past the fence line at the highest point. I didn't measure it. I didn't worry about it. Nobody from the HOA came to look at it or say a word. That was fine. That was more than fine. That was exactly how it was supposed to be. The winter that followed was milder than the previous one, as if the world itself had decided we'd earned a break. Temperatures stayed reasonable, the storms were manageable, and the road crew in Pinecrest Meadows stayed ahead of the snow for once. I burned my way through that cord and a half at a leisurely pace, enjoying fires in the evenings without the urgency of the year before. The neighborhood was quieter in the good way, the way a neighborhood is quiet when things are running the way they should be and nobody is being harassed by a woman with a clipboard. I kept the security cameras running. I will probably always keep the security cameras running. But what they recorded that second winter was nothing more interesting than a fox investigating my garbage cans, Dave scraping his car in the morning, and the occasional deer that wandered through the alley from the tree line behind the subdivision. Nothing worth a phone call to anyone. Nothing that needed investigating or documenting or presenting to a board. Just the ordinary, undramatic, deeply satisfying life of a neighborhood at peace with itself, watching the snow fall, keeping the fires burning, staying warm. That's all any of us wanted. It took a pile of firewood and a very cold January to get there, but we got there. And I will stack that wood as high as I need to every single year for as long as I live in this house. Let Terri Abernathy and her clipboard rest somewhere else. Pinecrest Meadows was done with that chapter. We had written a much better one.